Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Boyd, and this is Steve Bazyl, and we're here today to talk about integrating your app with the Google Apps Marketplace. Before we get started, I do want to give you this URL, bit.ly/appswave, where you can view live notes and ask questions you have about this session on Google Wave. We'll try to be going through that a bit at the end. I'm sure you're used to this already. The other thing before we start is I want to introduce two things to you here. I want to talk first about the company called Smart Law Firm. It's a law firm that uses Google Apps for their business to do email and calendaring and docs and that sort of thing. And they use this application called Sassy Voice, which is a sample application we wrote for small and medium-sized businesses to do voicemail. It uses the Twilio APIs, which are awesome. Give a call out to those folks. All right. The agenda. First of all, we want to give an overview of the Google Apps Marketplace. How many of you already went to kind of the business session on the Google Apps Marketplace earlier today? Okay, there's some hands, but not all of you. So try not to fall asleep during that section, but there's going to be a little bit of repeat material there for a couple minutes. But then we're going to get into actually launching the Sassy Voice application on the Marketplace and go through each of the steps that you need to do to launch the application on the Marketplace. Then talk a little bit about the roadmap, and then go into the Q&A period that we talked about. OK, so the Marketplace. Well, Google Apps, we're focused on messaging and collaboration. We have apps like the Gmail, the Calendar, the Docs, all sorts of different types of apps that are really meant to provide businesses all of their messaging and collaboration tools they need without the usual hassle of IT administration. But our customers want more great cloud applications. They want applications which do things like CRM or project management, types of applications that we don't offer in the native Google Apps, but we can work together with you as developers to build those applications and offer them jointly to our customers. So here's the basic steps for selling your application on the Google Apps Marketplace. And really, fulfilling the need for all those different types of applications. First of all, you build your app. How many of you actually already have a SaaS application which you have out there for sale already? OK. How many of you are actually trying to launch a SaaS application that you're trying to sell? All right. So it gives a little idea of the breakdown here. You can build your app using any tools and any hosting provider you want. I mean, you're here at Google I/O. You're well aware of all the great tools that we provide for development, such as the Google Web Toolkit or the hosting of App Engine. But these aren't required, and I want to make sure that's clear. These aren't required to launch your application on the Google Apps Marketplace. You can use whatever tools or hosting provider you want. The next step is integrate your application with Google Apps, where the minimum point of integration here is the single sign-on via OpenID. We want to make sure that our customers have a real seamless flow to get into your application and get using it without having to create another username and password. But there are all sorts of other different integration points that are available for you as developers to offer greater value to your customers. You can integrate with Docs, you can integrate with Calendar, Contacts, all sorts of things. And we're going to be talking about some of those in the remaining part of this presentation. Of course, the next step is probably the most important step for most of you, and that's selling your application on the Marketplace. There are over 2 million businesses which use Google Apps, with over 25 million users in those businesses, and we're adding like 3,000 new businesses a day. So there's a huge audience to sell these applications to. You can also work with our reseller channel. There's about 1,000 resellers on the ground selling Google Apps, and they'd be happy to talk with you, I'm sure, if your solution offers value for their customers. And then you basically get to go wherever Google Apps goes. And for all of that, there's a one-time listing fee of $100, and then a 20% rev share, which is going to start in the second half of this year after we release our billing APIs. And we're going to be talking about those, too. So now that you've built and launched your application on the Marketplace, our customers have everything that they need in the cloud. And they're your joint customers as well. So they have the project management app. They have the sales and marketing apps. All of this in addition to the native messaging and communication apps that Google Apps provides. So now we really want to dive into building the Sassy Voice application. We're going to first start here talking about the Sassy Voice application as it existed prior to being listed on the Marketplace. We're going to show you the features of that application, and then Steve's going to show you diving into the integrations with Google Apps. So they're basic features. First of all, you can create a new account as a business. You can provision phone numbers for the employees of your business. and create and assign extensions, and then you can show the voicemails. Every employee can see their voicemails that came into the system. I'm going to hop over here to an actual web browser. So this looks like many applications you're already probably familiar with. Login page, and then an option to create accounts. So if we go to create account, we're asked to type in some information here. I'm going to pretend I'm a partner at the smart law firm. Switching careers here a little bit, but type in passwords here. My domain is smart law firm. Company name is smart law firm. Name of the card. I'm going to actually steal Steve's credit card here and use that. Steve, what's your credit card number? All right, I'll skip that part here. Hit purchase. So now I've signed up as a customer for the Sassy Voice application for my business, Smart Law Firm. And I can go through here and enter in all the different people in my company. So I can fill in Mary, John, Jane, Steve. I mean, I could fill all these people in. There's like 20 people that work for my company. I'd actually have to remember all their first names and last names, and for those of you who know me, I'm a little bit bad with names. So this would be very difficult for me to do. But we're going to show how that gets a lot easier when this application is listed on the Google Apps Marketplace. So after I fill out the list of each of the employees at the smart law firm, then they'll probably each receive an email that looks something like this. They're asked to click on that link and create a password. So they click on that link, they're entering their email address, they enter a new password, and then finally, after they do that, they're in to see their voicemail. All of this can be drastically improved. We can really improve the user experience here based off the information that we have with Google Apps. So now Steve is going to come up here and talk about integrating Sassy Voice with Google Apps and go through many of the APIs.
Thanks, Ryan. I'd like to show you the integrated version, and we'll take a look at a demo of that application, followed up by a dive into the code itself for how we did the various integrations. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the process of integrating. First thing you need is an application. Today, we're talking about Sassy Voice, but a few of you, raised your hand that you have an application that you think would be a good integration with Google Apps. Once you have your application, Google Apps has a set of APIs that allow you to access customer data. This includes things like contacts, calendars, their documents, even their email, and you could also do things like single sign-on with OpenID. Here you have to write code, right? This is a developer conference. We're developers. This is what we get paid to do. You have to write code to get and set data. You have to write code to do something interesting with that data in your application. Once you have your application integrated with Google Apps, you need to describe that integration in a simple XML document that we call a manifest. Here you would list the URLs for your application, various entry points. You would also describe the APIs that you use. You upload this into the marketplace, and it allows Google to make sure all the right bits are set and the right permissions are granted when an administrator installs your application. And so we could actually see this with the new version of Sassy Voice. I'm going to switch over here, and here we're actually logged into the marketplace as a vendor. We haven't published our application yet, but we can still preview it and install it using the same process that any customer would go through. So we're going to click this Add It Now button and install it onto the same domain that Ryan did before here. I need to be an administrator to install an app on my domain, so I'm going to log in. Fortunately, I do have administrator permissions. And we're going to see step 1 of the installation. And here it's just asking us to agree to the app's terms of service. Doesn't look too complicated. Don't need a lawyer to review this for me, so I'm going to agree and continue with the installation. The second step is probably the most important step of the installation process. And you have to make a critical decision here about 2 things. One is, do you trust the application developer? And 2, is the API usage that it's asking for appropriate for the application? For the first question, do I trust the developer? Yeah, Ryan looks pretty innocent. I'm happy with him. I'm not going to worry that he's going to steal any of my data. So let me just take a look at the APIs that we're using. It's asking for the user provisioning API to help us set up our accounts. Okay, seems reasonable. wants to export information into our doc list, and it wants to use the contacts to display information about people who leave us voicemail messages. Seems like a reasonable set of APIs for the application. I trust Ryan. I'm going to agree and grant him access. This next step is an optional step that not every application in the marketplace offers. Because Sassy Voice is, we have to allocate a new phone number for customers, we have to set up voicemail extensions, and we want to collect payment information, we want to do all those things before we enable the application for all the users on the domain. So I'm going to click through here, and you're also going to see the first integration point, which is single sign-on. So even though I don't have an account with Sassy Voice yet, as soon as I clicked that link, the application was able to authenticate me and create a new account. So if you compare this to the first version of the application that you saw, the installation process is already a lot easier. I don't have to enter in my email address. I don't have to create a new password. I only need to supply a little bit of information about our company, and then I can continue. And one thing I want to note is, while you're seeing this in the context of the administrator, the real power is this feature is available to every user for every application that they purchase. Just like a user can switch seamlessly between Gmail, Calendar, Contacts, Docs, we expect that they can switch between Gmail and a third-party application just as easily. So I'm going to continue here, and you'll see the second integration point, which is using the user provisioning API to get information about all the users in the domain. When Ryan went through this earlier, he was presented with a big empty form, and it would have taken him a lot of time to go and collect the information about all of his employees. Here, the application was smart enough to recognize, I'm a Google Apps customer, let me go get that data for you. So now as an administrator, all I need to do is review the information, make sure it looks okay, and approve it. So I'm really happy I got 10 minutes back. I'm going to approve it, and we're actually done with the setup, and I can enable it for all the users in my domain. Really simple. So let's actually take a look at how this is done. So single sign-on, as I mentioned before, is done with OpenID. OpenID is an open protocol for authentication on the web, and it allows the user to authenticate with multiple websites, but without sharing sensitive information like their credentials. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go very deep into OpenID, so you may hear or see things in the code that may be a little bit confusing. Don't worry about these. You don't need to understand all of the details right now. And the reason is it's actually quite easy to implement OpenID thanks to a lot of good libraries. Most of these are open source. The code that we're going to look at is for the PHP OpenID library. Sassy Voice is a PHP app. And that library is an open source library developed by JanRain. And we're also using a small add-on library that's available on code.google.com that just makes it easier to work with Google Apps. So we'll actually look at the code. And we just broke this down into 3 simple steps. One is just to initialize the library. The second, to make the authentication request. And the third, to handle the response back and log the user in. So our first step here is we need to build up the library. So we're building a consumer, which is our entry point into the library. And to do that, we need some storage. This is just to store some information about the identity providers that we're talking to. We're using memcache, which is perfectly fine in this case. We create our consumer, and then we have to call one helper method. What this does is it allows us to authenticate users for Google Apps knowing just their domain name. In this case, if I'm coming from smartlawfirm.com, it will know how to authenticate me based on that information. We return our consumer, and we're good to go. So now we have a library, and we can use that to authenticate a user when they hit our application. So first thing we need to do is actually make an authentication request for that user's domain. There are a lot of OpenID providers out there that you can authenticate to. So in order to do that, you need to say, who am I going to authenticate with? For Google Apps, you use the domain name. And there's 2 ways I can get this information. In the demo, what you saw was that domain name being supplied automatically in the URL. That is done with a very simple template mechanism that is available to installable apps. If somebody was coming straight to my website, I might want to display a form that says, please enter your email address or enter your Google Apps domain in order to log in. So once we have that information, we can create a request. But before we send the user off to authenticate, we want to get a little bit more detail about them. We want to get their email address and their name so we can get a little bit more personalization in our app. OpenID has an extension called Attribute Exchange, which allows for this. So we're going to create that extension, and we're going to add a couple lines to request email, first name, and last name. And then we're going to add that extension into our request, and then we're good to go. But we still need to get the user over to the identity provider, and so we'll do that by rendering a form with some JavaScript so that it will post the request over to Google. And the only reason we're doing the post here instead of a redirect is simply because these requests can get very large, depending on how much data you're asking for, the length of the domain name. And this is just a safer way to deal with some of the limitations that you might encounter with very long URLs. So, so far what we've done is, we have our library, we sent gotten a request from the user, sent a request, they're now over at their identity provider, in this case Google Apps, and they're being authenticated. Once that's done, they're going to come back, and we're going to get a post back from Google that has the details and the result of the authentication. So let's handle the response. Very similar as before, we basically just call a simple method to parse all the response data, and the libraries make this really easy. And we just want to make sure everything was successful. In this case, this is our happy path where a user was authenticated, and we'll pull out some information. The most important piece of information we get here is their identifier. This is a stable, unique identifier that we can use to correlate all logons for that user. But it's anonymous. It doesn't really tell us who that person is. That's why we asked for things like their email address, their first name, and their last name. So we'll pull those out from the response. And now that we have all this information, we can map that user to somebody in our database or create a new account if that's what we need to do. Once we have that, we can add them to the session, let them log into the app, and they're logged in. They never entered a username or a password. It all just happens via OpenID. One last bit of information that we need to provide is information in the manifest that describes how people access our application. And there are three things I want to point out in this part of the manifest. The first is the URL that we saw during the setup process. And here you can also see the template mechanism that I mentioned earlier that allows you to get the domain name that the user is coming from after they've installed. The two extensions, one is actually to place a navigation element in Google Apps. Installed applications can get a menu link alongside all the links that you have in Google Apps for Gmail, Calendar, Docs, and other Google services. Third-party applications are first-class citizens that get placed up there. The last bit is the OpenID realm. And this is actually a very important thing. By declaring your OpenID realm, it allows Google Apps to recognize authentication requests from an installed application. This allows us to make the user experience a little bit better because since the administrator installed the application and explicitly trusted it, we don't need to ask each individual user to approve the OpenID request and approve the sharing of their personal information. So that's our manifest. We have this uploaded, and now our app we can do single sign-on. The user experience, as you saw earlier, is very smooth. Before we get into the data access, I just want to do a quick recap on single sign-on. Basically, what you saw with this is with a little bit of code in PHP, not much more than probably less than 100 lines. We were able to authenticate the user. We were able to get their unique identity along with some personal information about them. One quick note is on things like email, you still want to do things like send a confirmation message to make sure they really own that email address. Or you want to do something like whitelist trusted providers. Since Google Apps is managed, you can actually trust the email addresses, and it's very simple to add a line of code to say if this response is from google.com, we don't need to actually validate the message. We know it's good. So let's switch gears a little bit to data access. Data access is done with the Google Data APIs. These are RESTful APIs built on the Atom Publishing Protocol. They're pretty easy to use, basically because there's a lot of great libraries out there. There's libraries in most languages. Today, we're looking at code with the Zend GData library. First thing we have to worry about, though, is how do we actually get access to the user's data? We need to be authorized to do that. And the way you do that with GData is with OAuth. And OAuth is simply, it's an open standard protocol for allowing for basically delegating access to a third party in a secure way. For Marketplace, we use a variation called two-legged OAuth. In traditional OAuth, that approval and that delegation step is done on an individual user basis. So the first time a user wants to grant your application access to context, you have to request that access. The user will see a pop-up asking for authorization, and that establishes that everything is good to go. In two-legged OAuth, we actually do that at install time, and it's done by the administrator on behalf of all the users in the domain. The way we do this is by listing the APIs, or in this case, the scopes that we want in the manifest. And as you saw earlier during the install process, the administrator is then asked to approve that. Once that approval is given, the application can then access the APIs on behalf of all the users in that particular domain. They don't have to ask each individual user to approve a request token for them. So on the data access side, we're just going to break this down into two pretty simple steps. One, as we did in OpenID, let's just initialize a library. In this case, we're just doing this to establish our credentials for our application. We need 2 bits of information here. We need to know our consumer key and our secret. These are the equivalents of our application's username and password. The rest here is just mostly boilerplate code saying we're going to use a signature here to sign the request with our key and secret. We're going to pass this as a request header. And again, some more boilerplate code to initialize a library. What this gives us now is we now have an HTTP client that is initialized with our application credentials, and we can use that to access the data on behalf of the users that installed our application. So let's take a look at how we did that with the provisioning API. We start with our client that we just created and create a service object around it. This is simply a helper object that makes working with the Google APIs a little bit easier. And we make a query. So for the provisioning API, the query that we're making is get me the users for a particular domain, and that we're using the currently logged on user's domain. And this we can actually get from the URL, we can get it from their email address, or from their OpenID. We make that query, and what we get back is a list of users. And we can simply iterate through these, extract out the key bits of information that we want. In this case, we want username, their first, last names, whether or not they're an administrator. And now we can take this data and use it in our application in a meaningful way. In this case, what you saw earlier was using it to pre-populate the database and pre-populate that form to make the setup a lot easier for the administrator. So I'm going to switch over to the demo again and show this from the user's perspective. So let's switch over to Gmail. And here you can actually see this navigation menu that I mentioned earlier, where along with mail, calendar, documents, and sites, we have a list of additional applications that we installed. And these are actually applications from the marketplace. Some of these are new, some of these were around at launch, but I care about Sassy Voice. So I'm going to click over, and just like we were signed in seamlessly before as the administrator, I get the same experience as a user, although right now it seems to be acting a little bit slow, but that's OK. We can wait just a sec for the demo. All right, there we go. So I didn't have to enter a username or password. I just clicked the link. I'm signed in, and I'm not seeing any data. There we go. So here we actually have our voicemails for this user. And already somebody left me a voicemail. This is one from one of our favorite customers, Litigious Larry. He's really, really good business for the law firm. Let's see if I can actually play his message.
Hey, Steve, this is Larry. Just wanted to follow up about my most recent case against that hospital. Let me know how it's going. Thanks.
So there's Larry, again, a really great customer for us. But one thing you'll notice here is another integration point. Instead of just showing caller ID information, his phone number, or just a simple name, what we're seeing here is information from our contacts. And so basically by joining that phone number against our contacts database from Google Apps, we can show more context in our voicemail. So if I want to call Larry back on his cell phone, I see those here. If instead of calling him back, I just want to send him a quick email, I can click that link, and I get my Gmail Compose window, and I can just send him a quick note. Except I have a little bug in there that I hope nobody noticed. The other integration I want to show is on the call log. So as an administrator, I can see all the voicemails and all the calls that our domain received, our company. But this isn't a really useful form for the data, and maybe at some point, Sassy Voice would implement some really great reporting features, but that's a lot of work to do. There's actually a really easy tool out there that a lot of people know how to do reporting in, and it's just a spreadsheet. So rather than build in a lot of rich reporting features into the app, we just added a very quick ability for a user to export the call log into Google Apps, and that's done as a spreadsheet. So we'll see that spreadsheet open up in a sec. And I'm just going to reformat it a little bit just to make it prettier. And let's do a little bit of quick analysis. I want to find out who has the most phone calls. So we'll just do employee and number of calls. And we'll get all the unique users. And let's get a count of their calls. There we go. So I get how many calls everyone made, and let's just make a little chart out of this. We can do insert chart. Bar chart seems pretty reasonable. Save it, and now I get a nice, very quick, very easy visualization of who's getting the most phone calls in our domain, and you can see here it's Joe, Billy, and Steve. Very easy thing to do. So let's just see how we did these last two integrations. These are actually very similar to what we did with the provisioning API. On the contacts, very similar again. We create our client. We request information about the context for that user. And here's one difference between what you saw with the provisioning API. Because contacts are owned by an individual user, in order to make the request, you need to specify which user you're acting on behalf of. And the way you do that with two-legged OAuth is by including a query parameter that is X OAuth requester ID. The value of that is simply the email address of that user. So basically say, we get the email of the currently logged in user, add that to our query, and now we can go fetch the context. Just like we did with the provisioning API, we can simply iterate through those results, parse them into a form that's more suitable for our application. We want to do some things like index these by phone numbers. And now we can use this. So now I can keep that in memory, I can keep that in memcache, and just look up by phone number every time I get a voicemail, show the contact. Much more useful than just basic information from caller ID. The docs integration is a little bit different. First thing we need to do is we actually need a file to upload. So a little helper method to write out a CSV file. Not very interesting code to take a look at. But once we do this, we have a file. It's on our just a temp file on disk. But then we do what we did before. We create our client. In this case, Zen gives us a docs client. That makes this easy. Like contacts, we also need to specify the requester because docs are owned by individual users. We'll name it with a timestamp so users can know when this log was generated. And then upload the file as a CSV. By telling it it's a CSV file, Google Apps will know how to convert that into a spreadsheet. And the only reason we're using a CSV file here is just because it's just a really simple way of getting data into a spreadsheet. There actually is a spreadsheet API that lets you work with individual cells, but for something like a log file, it's just way too complicated when a CSV file will do the same job. The last thing we want to do is, once we've uploaded the doc, is pull out the edit URL for that so we can open up the spreadsheet for the administrator to actually start using. Again, we just take the resulting entry, iterate through the links to find the alternate representation. We have this URL. And now, once the file is uploaded, we can redirect the user over to Google Apps in a pop-up or in another tab, and they can actually use the data and start analyzing it. So before I hand it back to Ryan to talk about gadgets, I just want to do a quick recap. What you saw is, without adding a lot of code to the application, we were able to significantly improve the user experience. We were able to add single sign-on with OpenID, so users no longer had to explicitly create accounts or set up new passwords. We were able to make the setup process for the application a lot faster. As an administrator, I didn't have to enter in a lot of information to start using the application. And then from the user's perspective, we were able to add some features that made the application and the combination of Google Apps and Sassy Voice a better experience than if they were a standalone application. We were able to use the context to enrich the experience, and we're able to export data from our application into tools like spreadsheets that the administrators are already familiar with. So that's all I have. I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan, and he's going to talk to you about gadgets.
Thanks, Steve. So what Steve talked about was really taking Google Apps data and integrating that with your applications elsewhere on the web to make the user experience a lot easier. Gadgets are a way to do a little bit of the reverse. Many users spend a lot of their day inside email. It's unfortunate, I know. I really don't enjoy it that much either, but they spend a lot of time inside email or inside Calendar, inside these other applications that are part of Google Apps. And you want a way to take your application and put it inside those applications. This is what gadgets are all about. Gadgets are really your real estate inside Google Apps. So there are many different types of gadgets. I list them here. We're going to be talking about some of them. 2 new types of gadgets were actually announced this week. We have Gmail contextual gadgets, which just launched yesterday, and I'm going to show you examples of those. And then Wave gadgets. Well, Wave has been around for a while, and Wave gadgets have been around for a while, but just this morning, they announced the ability of Wave for Google Apps. So that's an exciting additional place that you can integrate your applications into. All of these use the Open Social Gadget specification. We're not going to get into the details of that. Really just showing you the different use cases for gadgets and hopefully inspire you for your applications. Gmail contextual gadgets. These are really awesome. These are perhaps one of my favorite launches that we've done recently, and it just happened yesterday. And really, they allow you to detect the content of email via regular expressions and display a gadget based off of that. The gadgets get displayed right below the email. We're going to show you one here. And basically, it allows you to put the business information that a user needs to have right in front of them in the context of their email, where they can immediately take action on it without opening up a new browser or tab to your application. So here is what Gmail looks like, and here you see that red arrow pointing to a gadget. So this is an email from Steve to me saying, John would like us to incorporate his company. Please let me know the next steps. And you can see at the bottom here, there's a gadget. This gadget is actually the ManyMoon gadget. ManyMoon is a project management application that's available on the Google Apps Marketplace. And what this gadget allows you to do is immediately take action on that and create a project or assign a task. So in this case, the gadget actually automatically pulled in the subject of the message, John Smith's company. I added the word incorporated on the front there. And then it has a place for assigning members to this project. So I want to assign it back to Steve to work on this project, and also invite an additional user, Kim, in my company. And those things can all be auto-completed from the Contacts API that Steve talked about. This is a really awesome contextual gadget. You've seen some other demos. I don't know how many of you saw the Campfire One, but Aperio there in the Campfire One demo showed their CRM Salesforce application that looked up the sender's email and immediately looked up the information about that sender in their Salesforce CRM system and made that available right in the context of gadgets. So it's really powerful. The next type of gadget that I want to talk about are calendar sidebar gadgets. Calendar sidebar gadgets can detect the currently displayed date range, can detect the currently selected event, and get lots of information about them, and even set information about them in the events. So why would you want to do this? Well, The sidebar gadgets exist in the sidebar, very much like another gadget that you're going to see here soon, the Gmail sidebar gadgets, but this time in Calendar. And this is an example of the TripIt gadget. TripIt, for those of you who don't know, is like a travel management application, really make it easy for you to know where all you're traveling to. And they actually integrate your upcoming travel schedule right inside Google Calendar. There's also another great calendar sidebar gadget that you guys should check out over in the developer sandbox that I just saw this morning. Again, the folks at Aperio, they make a lot of web-based meetings, and they use GoToMeeting, and they actually created a calendar sidebar gadget that allows them to create a GoToMeeting directly from an event. So it detects what the event is, reads in all the information about the date and time of the event, and gives them one button to click to create a GoToMeeting. Really powerful stuff. I encourage you all to check that out in the sandbox. So now I'm going to give you a demo to go back to the Sassy voice application that we've been talking about. I'm going to give you a demo of the Gmail sidebar gadget. I kind of alluded to that earlier, but I want to show it to you for real here. So I'm going to hop over to my web browser. We're on my Gmail login screen. I'm going to log in as Steve here. Don't tell anyone I have Steve's password. And you see on the left-hand side here is the Sassy voice application. And we see that voicemail from litigious Larry. In theory, I can click on this right here. I haven't tested this too much, but no, I guess I didn't test it quite enough. But you know, basically, I can display the content of my voicemails right alongside my email. It's a really great way in order to take your application and integrate it into Google Apps, where a lot of users are spending a lot of their time. Oops. OK, now you may wonder how these gadgets are distributed. There are two different types of gadgets for the marketplace, or for marketplace apps. The first one are admin-installed gadgets. So with a Gmail contextual gadget, if your application has a Gmail contextual gadget, just on the same page where you grant access to things like the calendar and the contacts, the administrator can also approve installing this contextual gadget to have access to the email. And this is installed for every user in the company, and then will trigger on the regular expression for every user. The other types of gadgets are user installed. We're certainly looking at making more of these available to be installed by an administrator. But many of these right now are user installed. And what that means, you just provide some simple instructions to your users how to install the gadget in various places like the calendar or mail. Now, there's one important topic here with gadgets. And there is another session, actually 2 sessions tomorrow on gadgets that I'll get to here shortly. But just a brief overview on this, the way that gadgets communicate. Well, gadgets use JavaScript using the open social gadget APIs. And they use JavaScript to request data from the application. In this case, the application is requesting data from the Sassy voice. The gadget is requesting data from the Sassy voice application. This data request is all proxied through the container, or Gmail in this case. And this is all to avoid cross-domain issues. Gmail then adds information, as the container adds information to this request, includes like the ID of the current viewer, and signs all this information. The Sassy voice application then verifies the signature, verifies it's Google who signed the request, and gets out this open social ID number, 3412564561, or whatever it is, gets out that number. Now, the next things we'd like to do, we'd like to have that application to render the list of voicemails and display them in the gadget. That would be awesome. But the problem is we don't know who this user is. So who is 34124561? This is just their open social ID. Our application, Sassy Voice, is often accessed as a full web application, and we don't know what their open social ID is. So you want to do open social, you want to do a mapping between the open social ID and OpenID. And you can do the OpenID right within the gadget. And I'm going to show you a little demo here of that. Keep in mind that this is a quick sample. The user experience can definitely be improved, and I'm sure you'd have many ways to do that. But I go down here, and this is the very first time I, as a user, access this gadget. I hit sign in. Since it's a marketplace application, it just goes right away. I don't need to grant access. My administrator has already granted access for my identity to pass on to that application. And the application signs me in. And what it does after it signs me in is actually stores in the database table for the Sassy Voice application a mapping between my OpenID and my OpenSocial ID. So from then on, for the life of this user, I never have to do OpenID in the gadget. OpenID, at times can be a little slow that first time around, especially within a gadget if you had many different apps doing it at the same time. So we really want to avoid doing it with every single time I visit this gadget, and this is the way that you can do that. So now testing your application. As you saw, I didn't test that gadget too well in playing the voicemail. So you really want to make sure you test your application. You guys know this. You're going to test your application thoroughly. But there are some things that you might want to keep in mind for testing the Google Apps integrations of your application. And so there's a number of things that we've noticed. We initially worked with about 50 some odd people to launch on the marketplace when the marketplace launched in March. 50 some odd vendors, and now we have over 100 vendors in the marketplace. And so we've gained a collection of best practices, and we put them together as a checklist on code.google.com. So before you submit your app to the marketplace, please go through this checklist. It makes it a lot easier to get you approved faster on the marketplace. But there's a lot of great things here. I'm going to highlight a couple of them. And I'm going to actually back up here. So realm mismatch. Realm mismatch. So OpenID has this concept of a realm. The realm is usually your website, usually the root of your website. And what this basically does is all OpenID requests that happen with that path involved are all grouped together. And you specify a realm in your manifest file. That manifest XML file that Steve showed you, you specify the realm there, but you also specify it when you actually perform your OpenID requests. This may all seem like jarbly, good to you, but you should recognize this when you go to launch your app on the marketplace. Make sure that the value in your OpenID requests and in your manifest match up, because that allows this whitelisting to occur where I never have to, as a user, authorize passing my identity to the web application because my administrator has installed it and already granted that privilege. The next thing is OpenID for Google Apps. As many of you are probably aware, there are two different types of Google accounts. There are Google consumer accounts, or oftentimes referred to as Gmail accounts, although they can be on any domain. And then there are Google Apps accounts, which are where businesses host their email on their own custom domain and calendar and docs and that sort of thing. Well, you want to make sure you implement OpenID for Google Apps accounts. We've had some vendors just implement the consumer version of it, but you want to make sure you implement it for Google Apps accounts. There's only a slight difference in the discovery, in the OpenID discovery, and the libraries actually take care of that for you, the libraries that Steve pointed out. So, but you just really want to make sure that you actually implement that. And third, and perhaps most important, support existing users. When you first launch your app on the marketplace, I'm assuming you're going to tell all of your customers, because your customers actually are the ones that have probably been asking for these Google Apps integrations because they use Google Apps and they use your application. You want to make sure to support those users. We had a couple apps launch at first on the marketplace that basically treated everyone as new customers, and the existing users had a suboptimal flow through the application. So you really want to make sure to support existing users. This basically means during that install flow process, you want to ask the person, are you an existing user? If so, enter in your username and password once, and we'll link that up to the OpenID. If you're not an existing user, click here and get started right away. Sell. This is why you're all here, selling your application on the marketplace. And we're going to go through the different steps for that. First of all, Steve talked to you about the manifest file and the format of that. You want to get that all together into your copy buffer, and then you want to go visit the marketplace. So you go to google.com/appsmarketplace, and then at the top right, you click on Sign In, and then you'll be able to create a vendor profile, which is just a little bit of information about your company, name and address and that sort of thing. And then you get to create a new listing. And here's what the listing page looks like. The listing page is mostly marketing information. So if your developers in the room, you don't care about most of that, you can ignore it. Send your marketing folks a note, ask them for that information. But it's things like the name, description of the application, some key benefits of the application, and some collateral like screenshots and videos and that sort of thing. But the important part here for as a developer audience are the manifest files. You already have that manifest there. You copy and paste it into the manifest box here, and then you're ready. You can then test your application on as many domains as you want before you publish it. And when you're ready to publish it, after going through that testing checklist, of course, you click I am ready, submit this listing for approval. And then this goes through a very simple approval process at Google, and we do a couple things. One, verify that you've met that minimum bar of implementing OpenID. Two, verify that you've respected the Google brand appropriately, and there are a few simple guidelines on that. And three, you're actually a business app. You're not trying to launch a bunch of adult material on the marketplace. So very simple guidelines for approval, and we do that within a couple days. So now you're actually listed on the marketplace, and you're available for sale. And here's actually a quote from one of the vendors that's in the marketplace. You guys can talk to them again out in the sandbox, but they notice a large number of customers coming in from the Google Apps marketplace, and you can see the graph of that there. But the key thing I want to point out here is that their customers cite their really strong integration with the various data points as a key feature of why they purchased the application. So you want to make sure not to just have that minimum bar, but to actually do some additional integration in order to make the lives of your customers a lot easier. Okay, so that's basically where we are today. I want to talk about the roadmap. And as you're probably all familiar with, Google doesn't often talk about the roadmap. So I want to talk first about some recent launches. We have the Gmail contextual gadgets, just launched yesterday, as we mentioned. OAuth support for Gmail's IMAP and SMTP services launched a couple months ago, and it's a great way to get access to email, whether approved by the individual user or approved by the domain administrator. You can use the standard IMAP and SMTP protocols for that access. And as you heard today, the launch of Wave for Google Apps, and there's some developer opportunities available there as well. So the big thing on the roadmap are the billing APIs. The goals of the billing APIs. We didn't go too much into the administrator view of these applications during this session. But when you install an application from the apps marketplace, all the applications are listed alongside the other Google apps in the Google Apps control panel. So the administrator has one view where they can see all their cloud applications and configure them and assign them appropriately and that sort of thing. Well, we want to do the same thing for billing. We want to provide a really simplified invoicing and payment system for billing so that Google Apps customers have one place to go to manage the billing for all their cloud applications. They don't have to go to a bunch of websites around the web in order to configure this and enter their credit card number a dozen times and that sort of thing. So we're planning to launch our billing APIs in the second half of this year. They're required for installable apps after a transition period where you can integrate with them. And the revenue sharing starts once the billing APIs are adopted. There's all sorts of different features of these billing APIs. Like I mentioned, we now have over 100 apps in the marketplace and 100 business-focused applications that are there. And they all have different billing models and different ways of collecting payment from their customers. We're well aware of that, and we're going to be working with them as we design and implement these APIs to make sure that as many possible use cases of billing are met before we release these billing APIs. So to learn more about all of this, there are a number of different I/O sessions coming up. Tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a session along with Dave Primer, a fellow engineer, on OpenID and OAuth for Google Apps. And this session's not going to really dive into the details of the protocols, but is really going to help you understand when each of these flavors of OpenID and OAuth should be used, for what types of applications and for what types of user scenarios. Then we're going to follow those sessions with 2 sessions by Dan Holyvote on our gadgets team. And he's going to be talking about gadgets for Google Apps and then dive into the details of Gmail contextual gadgets that launched yesterday. So I encourage you all to check those out. And then there are a number of different online resources available. We have a site for our business and marketing folks to learn about the value proposition of the Google Apps Marketplace, a site for the technical folks to learn how to code their integration. If you all just want to go shopping, I mean, I'd love for you to all launch an app on the marketplace, but if you just want to go shopping, I'm not going to stop you. There's the URL. Go buy a bunch of apps. I'm sure your fellow developers will be happy with that. And if you don't have Google Apps, not quite sure why you're in this room currently, but you can go to google.com/A and buy Google Apps, or use the free standard edition as well. So now we're going to go over into our question and answer period. I'm going to open up moderator. But before I do that, I want to encourage all of you to stop by the Sandbox and see all the different types of applications. Many of the Sandbox partners are actually in the marketplace. And they do also have T-shirts to hand out to you. You may have to listen about their application, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it. To get a T-shirt, awesome T-shirt for the Google Apps Marketplace. So stop by there, and we'll also be around, obviously, over time. So you can step up to the mics, and we can go over to moderator. While I'm going over to moderator, I want to take the first question from the mic here.
I also posted a moderator. Jared with a Wayfind. We were one of your contextual gadgets. Thank you guys for the help. I'm just curious if in the future, in the process of an admin installing for the entire domain, if they'll have any ability to be kind of a little bit more granular in terms of who they select to have a particular application, or if it has to be the kind of the whole thing at once.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a request that we hear often, and is something that we're looking at doing. It's basically, right now, when a domain administrator installs an app on the Google Apps Marketplace, it's immediately available to all users in the domain. There are some types of applications where it's more relevant for the application to only be available to a subset of users, whether it be a particular group of people, like the payroll department or things like that. And so, yeah, it's definitely something that we're looking into. I don't have any promises on dates or promise that we'll do it, but it is something we're aware of as a constant need.
Thanks.
So let's go through here on this presenter view. Is there a way to implement step-up authentication even after single sign-on through OpenID? Steve?
Who asked that question? Or
someone raise their hand.
I'm not quite sure what the feature asking for. There is an extension to OpenID for people that need to force authentication. If you want to make sure that user is really at their keyboard, it's called the provider authentication policy extension, and you can basically say make sure the user has been logged in within the last n seconds. So you can do 15 minutes or whatever, and it's a way that you can make sure that the user is present. In terms of things like strong authentication, that's not a feature that we have in Google Apps at this time. But if whoever asked that question, if you can clarify what you're looking for, it would help.
You can always come and see us after the session as well. All right, another question at the mic?
Okay. In the presentation, to get the data access from the user, we need to use two-legged OAuth. But I'm wondering if we can use three-legged OAuth as well.
Yes, you can.
Is it supported as well?
So two-legged OAuth, we believe, has some advantages for the administrators and for the end users. Two-legged OAuth basically has the advantage that the administrator is granting access to the data, and it's granted once by the administrator instead of by each of the individual users, which is what three-legged OAuth is used for. We think this has a distinct advantage because the administrator is the one that often owns the data and has the rights to grant access to it. Individual users may be kind of confused as to whether it is okay with their company's security policies, but the administrators are the ones that can do that. So that being said, we do actually have a number of apps in the marketplace that do use three-legged OAuth to access users' data, and they prompt individual users for access to their data, and that's fine. There's a few little bits in the UI of the marketplace that are automated based off of like the two-legged OAuth and being in the manifest, so you won't get those. But you can use three-legged OAuth if you want in a marketplace application. Just keep your users in mind and figure out what the best way is for them.
Yeah. The only thing that we discourage with three-legged is using the OpenID OAuth hybrid mode that allows you to combine them, because that will break the whitelisting. And there's OpenID on Premier domains is disabled by default, so you actually need a very bad user experience on Premier domains if you use hybrid. But you can still do OpenID and then OAuth separately, and that will work fine.
Thanks.
So the next question we'll take quickly is from the moderator. Is there a way to integrate Google Talk like they did in Jira Studio? So Google Talk actually uses the open standard XMPP for communication, and the only issue with Google Talk right now is that it does require the user's username and password to log into it. As I mentioned earlier, we launched OAuth support for IMAP and SMTP, so we're not opposed to extending standard protocols and adding OAuth support to make it more secure. But we haven't announced yet that the availability for that for XMPP or Google Talk. It's certainly something that we're considering. So next up, do we have any other questions at the mic? No? Okay. So in the demonstration, all the domains users were provisioned and charged at once. Can the administrator choose? So this was the same question from the folks at Awayfind. In terms of, to clarify this, is when you install a marketplace application as a domain administrator, the application is installed and available in the universal navigation, the bar at the top of email, calendar, et cetera. It's installed and available for all the different users, but you can actually, as a vendor in the marketplace, choose to bill however you want. So you can choose to say that only 5 users accessed this application this month, even though there are 50 people in the company, so I'm only going to bill for 5 users. Or you can actually do named licenses where during the administrator flows, you actually ask the administrator to list the people in their company that they want to have access to the application, and you can manage that yourself. We're just not doing it in an automated fashion yet on our side, but that, again, is something that we're definitely considering.
One quick question. What you're advising regarding Google App Engine applications, because in Google App Engine you have a users API, but in the Google Apps marketplace you are pushing OpenID flow, so you have only one instance of your application. So I don't know what's the best practice there.
Sure. So we do have a number of different App Engine apps that are in the marketplace. Most of them don't use the user API. They just use OpenID or have their own method of authenticating against the data store or things like that. You can certainly take that strategy. We are certainly looking at how to make the development process easier for App Engine apps to hook into things like OpenID. There's nothing out there yet that does that exactly, but so my recommendation at this point would be not to use the user's API, instead use OpenID. I don't know if that's practical if you already have a launched app, but I'm happy to talk with you about it after this session, and we can go into details.
Thanks.
Sure.
So on your demo, you were able to set up accounts for existing users. Can you hook up to the user creation event for if you add new users to your domain?
So the provisioning API, when you get access via two-legged OAuth, if the domain administrator grants you access via two-legged OAuth during the install process, you can actually then access that API offline. That's one of the benefits of two-legged OAuth, is that the user doesn't necessarily have to be at their keyboard for you to access the API. So you could actually query the provisioning API and see if there are new users and set those users up, or do something like send an email to the domain administrator and say, hey, we see the following new users, click on this link below to set them up, or use the contextual gadgets and do that all within the concept, in the context of the email. All sorts of different ways that you can handle that, but you could handle the users in a later flow. Like I was trying to allude to, it's not, as far as Google is concerned at this point, the app's installed for the entire domain. As an application developer, you can choose how to restrict access and how to manage that access at this point.
Yeah. And one other note on that, a lot of the apps in the marketplace, even though they may have a setup process similar to what we showed, they don't actually create the user accounts until the first time the user logs in. That's one of the advantages with the OpenID and the attribute exchange, is the same information that we got with the provisioning API, we just as easily could have gotten the very first time that user hit the app, and then just add them on demand.
So the next question here, does this apply to mobile apps if one has an enterprise mobile version? So right now, like the universal navigation flow and all isn't available on the mobile versions of our applications, although certainly one of these users that has bought the application through the Google Apps Marketplace could access your mobile version and do OpenID flow in a mobile browser just the same. And then the final question is the $100 one-time per application or per developer. It is per developer, so each vendor account has a $100 one-time fee, and then you can list as many unique applications in the marketplace as you want after paying that one-time fee. And then will there be recurring billing? Recurring billing is obviously a feature that a lot of apps in the marketplace use. That's definitely something that we're considering for as we're designing the billing API. And that's all. Feel free to catch up with us after this session, or we'll be in office hours in the sandbox and that sort of thing, and ask any additional questions you have. And don't forget to pick up your t-shirt after talking with the sandbox partners. All right.